Laura, welcome along to this week's edition of the Huddle Breakdown, where I am pleased to welcome our friend, Laura Bradburn, to join us again this week in her second foray into the Huddle Breakdown universe, shall we say. And we have some news to announce this week. Despite some really weird rumors that have been floating about, some agent talk in the papers about Laura being offered a long-term contract by Heart and Hand. I don't know if this, Laura, was this your agent trying to create a bidding war with us or something? I don't know, but yes, we've secured Laura as a long-term signing to be the host of the weekly show. So thank you, Laura, and welcome again.
Yeah, thank you for having me. As innocent as your little quip about a link to a Rangers podcast might be, there's a particular article about Marco Negri that I wrote 8 years ago that will just not go away. So thanks for dredging that up. I'm sure that'll go down well.
Things never die in the digital world, Laura. They never die. Well,
was that the one where he was going on about the culture at Ibrox and how he hated it? That's been held up as a spoof. Is it that one?
No, I really wish that had particular quote had been available around the time. But no, I got into all sorts of stuff about how the supposed squash accident wasn't a squash accident and all that kind of stuff. So anybody who wants to go back, yeah. So I mean, it's my one and only foray into writing about Rangers, and despite what some people say, I wasn't as complimentary as they like to make out, but yeah.
Was that squash the sport or squash the fruit, a la Kurt Broadfoot and his eggs?
Oh, the less said about that, the better.
Yeah.
But like James said, I'm happy to have signed a permanent contract. The guys have exercised the option to bring me in on a permanent basis. So hopefully I'm more Adam Maeda and less Paulo Bernardo, but we will see how that goes. I guess better to get started and get into things. Obviously, we are recording this following the weekend that was the victory over Hibs in the League Cup. We are now through to the quarterfinals with a tasty little tie against Falkirk coming up. Unfortunately for them, we don't have Ryan Christie to blast the ball over the bar and then subsequently into the net, but I'm sure we'll find something to laugh about with them at the next fixture. James, I'll come to you first. General thoughts on the game? I know we're going to talk about Dyson Maida and his slightly different role in the game, but what were your overall thoughts of the performance at the weekend?
Well, first I have to, address the elephant in the room, which is the existential crisis that Alan Morrison's going to face in the quarterfinal, where his allegiances are truly questioned between
Here we go.
his subversive childhood club and the one he claims to support now. I don't know, but we'll get to that when we get closer to that
It's
date,
just the American. Doesn't even know what football is.
Oh, touche.
Yeah.
No, I thought it was a different form of the same thing of the prior weekend in many regards. I thought that, we kind of did our thing, and our thing is a good thing right now. I mean, to put it bluntly. So we're a well-oiled machine. We've got, some very important attacking players that are playing pretty well right now, like Kuhn, and obviously we'll get on to Maeda, had a good game. But Kyogo's been having good games at the striker position as well. So that hasn't really, that wasn't really much of a change. What did change was how Hibs approached the game. And I think they had a different, as Alan's fond of saying about the shift in our transfer model, going from one version of bad to another. I think Hibs went from one version of not a great strategy to a different version of not a great strategy, which to Gray's credit, he did switch then intra-game after maybe about 35 minutes. And we can get into some of that as well. But yes, I thought it was, pretty good overall, and continues to be encouraging, pending, I think, an actual test, which I think St. Mirren, as we look towards next weekend, is going to be a very different type of test. But the first time that we'll face more of a disciplined, kind of narrow, more defensive opposition, and Hibs wasn't.
Yeah. Alan, James brings up a good point that perhaps domestically anyway we haven't seen a significant challenge or opposition so far. Sort of something to really test ourselves against. Do you agree with that in terms of, does that slightly dampen the encouraging signs we've seen from some of the play this season? Or do you think it's more of a case of we're actually just not being tested enough by the opposition that we've seen so far?
Yeah, I think we tend to, as football fans, use the word damp and sort of see things as either positive or negative, and they can't be. They have to be one or the other. They have to be extremely one or the other, and they can't be in the middle. And kind of we are the grey persons in a podcast. We operate in that grey area, so it is, as we're fond of saying, all about context. So you could make a case for saying, well, Easter Road is actually the hardest domestic ground that Celtic have to visit. That is demonstrably true by the facts, and also equally so is that Kilmarnock, where finished fourth in the league, gave Celtic a lot of problems, and I would actually, as I argued all of last season, to my mind, were other than the vagaries of fortune in football, probably were the third best team in Scotland last year. So you could argue actually it's a really tricky start to the season, but context is everything, as we said. So, Kilmarnock played us mid two very difficult European ties for them. They had a couple of key defensive players not playing in that match, and Derek McInnes went out of his way to make excuses for how his players were going to lose that game before it started, which, as I said in the pod, just basically gave them a free out for losing that match. And then Hibernian are under a new manager, a lot of new players, and basically David Gray has been through the big book of football tactics and pretty much used every formation under the sun in the two games against Celtic, all to no avail. In both games, the common denominator has been 5 goals in the first 20 minutes across the 3 games, which has then allowed Celtic an element of control over the game. We've not had to chase goals, we've not had to chase XG, we've not had to stress to create great chances, because we've had control of these games from very early on. So that's a good thing. It's a good thing that we've done that. But it also means we haven't been stat padding by, sort of maybe adding goals late on. But I come back to some of it has been down to the incoherence of the opposition. And I think, what I will say to turn a negative into a positive is that whilst Hibernian looked like they decided to go with a 3-5-2 to start with, which really was a sort of 5-3-2 out of possession. But they decided to man mark McGregor, and they decided to man mark O'Reilly, and then that was it. And then everybody else was kind of free. And basically the net result of all that was they left massive gaps all over the pitch. And to Celtic's credit, the Celtic players were intelligent enough to see that, and especially down the right hand side, Carter Vickers, Johnson, Kuhn, O'Reilly down that right really exploited the fact that Bushiri kept coming out to man mark O'Reilly, and that left a huge gap between the centre back and the left wing back. And Celtic, basically prospered down that side to the extent that they got a 2-goal lead. They then went to a very deep 5-4-1 block, and then eventually ended up in a 4-4-2, and they were chasing the game. But by that stage, the damage had been done. But what I would say is of credit Celtic for having the intelligence to actually exploit the obvious weaknesses in Gray's. It looked like he had a good idea, but either they hadn't trained it properly, or they're just incompetent at executing it, or whatever it was. It was really, really kind of poor. We've seen this. We saw it with Naismith at Hearts, and it's one of James and I's favourite topics is Gary Naismith's lack of management acumen. In that, again, at the weekend, and I'll bring up Falkirk. Hey, where again he changed the formation, he changed the lineup, and they got a really bad outcome from that. And so listen, you've got to credit Gray for trying to change things up, but when you implement it so badly, who's that on? Is that on the players, or is it on the manager? So, but as I say, for me, credit to Celtic, and especially the fullbacks. Actually, Taylor and Johnson both had really, really strong games in exploiting those weaknesses.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think no more evident was that than in the closing down of Kuhn for that goal on the goalkeeper. That kind of exploiting their weaknesses and exploiting what they were not doing so well. We are going to come back, Alan, to you in a little bit and look a bit of a deep dive that you've had in the aftermath of the game, looking at how Celtic limit chances, and we'll do that in a second. But James, I just wanted to come back to you. Alan touched on it there, some of the various ways and some of the various players within the lineup who exploited some of Hibs' weaknesses, none more so than I would say Dyson Maida through the middle for Celtic as a striker, obviously with Kyogo being injured and Adam Ida still being fresh off the transfer market. So I just wanted to ask you, now being Dyson Maida's number one fan, as everybody knows I am, everybody knows what I think of him and his fantastical football ability. But all joking aside, I really, really like him when he's playing through the middle. I like him playing through the middle when he's playing for Japan. I think he looks much more at home playing there. He doesn't have to have Harry Kewell taking him out and coaching him on how to do crosses before matches. 2 goals against Hibs. Do we have our third choice striker there, in effect, in Dyson Maida? Is that a preferred position for you for him?
I think selectively, yes. I think as a depth piece to provide, kind of a mini version of Kyogo, let's call it, meaning that very similar in profile, not necessarily physically, but style of play, benefiting from more of the the striker role, the lower volume of touches under, let's say, an Ange Ball type of regime. If he was utilized in that way, he's not a striker that I'd want to be dropping deep and helping in build up because of some obvious issues with his touch and distribution of the ball, that sort of thing. But I think the easiest way for me to kind of address that relative to this game, because Alan referenced it, because he looked incredible. I mean, he's kind of tailor-made to capitalize on the vulnerabilities that Hibs presented. And you have not heard one of my cross-sport analogies yet, so I need to introduce one of those. I'll make it brief. If you've heard of George Mikan, I know you guys are huge NBA fans, basketball fans. No, I'm shocked to hear this, but he was the first kind of revolutionary big man in basketball back in, I think it was the mid to late 1950s. And they actually had to change the rules of basketball because what he would do is just camp underneath the basket, and he's like a 7-footer when everyone would look like me, 6 foot, 6'2", that kind of thing. And he would just turn around, shoot, and no one could stop him. So they actually broadened what used to be called the key, because they had a narrow lane, broadened that and said you couldn't be in there more than 3 seconds to change the competitive dynamics so that George Mikan couldn't destroy everybody. And so why do I get into this? Because along with the 3-point line in basketball, the games have changed, and the farther away you are from the basket, it's harder to score. Well, football's the same. If you're 40 yards away and you're close to the touchline, you're probably not going to score from there. You can create chances, but we know, it's one of the things that the analytics revolution has brought about, is that those kind of crosses are really not that great from a chance quality perspective. So what Hibs did in both games, they did it in different ways, was they liked to man mark and defend out wide. So to Alan's point, we were really smart and overloaded wide, drug them out of position, and then Maeda could run in behind. So maybe it would make sense if they put in a 3-point line or 2-goal line. Is that what it would be, I guess, in football, for Hibs to deploy such a strategy? But in the context of, what we know now from a probabilities perspective, I mean, Maida's like superpower is getting in behind and making those runs. And there were some great deliveries, obviously, to get him the ball again. Kuhn shining through again. I think selectively, he's not the striker I'd want at Kilmarnock in February when Kilmarnock decides to, kind of bunker in a windy environment, that kind of thing. But in the European stage, I think there's actually a reasonable case to be made that he might even be preferable to Ida as a second choice because of what he brings from a pressing and a defensive perspective, as well as that getting in behind and the pace that he offers.
So from that analogy, James, what I'm picking up, and Alan, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is you hit the ball with the big stick, it goes out the park, and then you call that touchdown or something? I don't know. That's about as much I know about American sports. But anyway, I do appreciate the education I'm going to get on that over the weeks to come, James.
How long is this contract for?
She's already opting out.
Well, yeah, what are the exit clauses?
Yeah, the window's still open till the end of August. You can get rid of me until then. Alan, let's go back to what we were talking about. You raised a couple of interesting points when we were preparing for the show, talking about the way in which Celtic limited chances, both against Hibs, against Kilmarnock, and how it seems to be becoming a feature of our play, both defensively and in attack. What have you found has become this kind of trait, or notable patterns that have exhibited this trait when you've been watching the opening games of the season?
Yeah, listen, this is just an observation. This isn't a kind of firm kind of fact at this stage. We're talking about 3 games, and I've given the context of those 3 games in terms of where Kilmarnock were, where Hibs are in terms of their development as a team as well. So we need to be really, really careful here. But I have to say there are echoes, little tremors in the wind, if you like, of where we got to under Ange Ball in season 2, where Celtic's dominance and control was so pervasive that the opposition struggled to create any chances at all. I mean, in the 3 matches so far, the average XG is incredibly low, and I think it is as well that the teams are actually averaging less than 0.08 XG per shot, right? So the XG per game against is 0.35, which last season it was nearly 1. So I know it's only 3 games, and there were 3 game periods last season where you could say equally it was a similar number. But I'm putting that into the context of as James talked about, the level of coherence that the team has been playing with, and that is a factor in that. The number of shots on target that the teams have had in those 3 games, the touches in the penalty area, the number of defenders that they've packed out of the game. I've got an aggregated attacking threat score. That's almost half what it was for opponents in Scotland last season. Basically, if you took a number of attacking metrics over those 3 games, they were about 50% less than the averages last season. Again, too early to draw conclusions, too early to be, turning giddy status to 11. But it's just encouraging signs at this stage, and little echoes of what happens when you have a manager who's managed to, put into a team that level of cohesion that we're seeing with Celtic. And it's simple things. Possession is up from 68% to 75%. Just sheer the number of on-ball events that we're having, up from 760 to over 880. Just the accuracy is improving as well. So last season, I have a thing which I calculate, which is called Possession Effectiveness Index. Again, apologies, it's a horrible name. Essentially, if you look at all on-ball events, it's a ratio between those that result in you losing the ball, those that result in you keeping the ball. Last season, that was 81%. This season, it's 85%. That's actually a significant difference if it maintains over a number of games. So listen, and this is all despite the fact that in these 3 games, we're actually playing a slightly less aggressive defensive line. We've actually dropped back about over a metre.
Just to interject there, I thought you were going to say it, and this is all despite the fact we're playing Liam Scales, but carry on. I wouldn't
do that. That's personal and nasty and vindictive, Laura. We don't do that here, by the way. If you're talking about Greg Taylor now, we can get onto that. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Now listen. So we're actually pressing less. So as I said last season, Rodgers' team actually was more aggressive in pressing and counter-pressing than Ange's team, but we're actually pressing less in the games so far. However, again, I'm sorry to introduce another mouthful, but passes per defensive action, which is an indicator of pressing effectiveness, teams are only managing 4.8 passes per Celtic defensive action. Last season it was 6.6, which means that because we're controlling the ball to such a large extent, we're rarely without the ball. When we are without the ball, we can really go for it from a pressing perspective, and we're just as effective as we were last season. But about 20% of Celtic presses result in a regain, and that hasn't changed. So what does that all mean? It means that we're just exerting a lot more control on the game in these 3 matches, and it's very difficult, therefore, for teams to create anything with a minimal amount of ball under heavy Celtic pressure. That all augurs well for the domestic scene. I'm not sure it scales, and that's pun intended. I'm not sure it scales to the European level, with the current manpower that we have. But it's just a little glimmer of something which I've found, which is very encouraging, and hopefully it will continue.
Yeah, James, I think that reflects a lot of the feeling around the way that we've opened the season. Despite the lack of new faces in the door, there definitely seems to be a greater level of understanding between players of what is being asked of them. There's almost what appears to be a slight change in style is actually perhaps Brendan eventually getting the players to play the way that he wanted, rather than having this kind of makeshift transfer between what Ange was doing to what he wants to do. Alan's talked about some of the figures there and the hope that those can be kept up. I guess the only question is, as we go further into the season, can you see us maintaining that level of performance, particularly when the squad is as thin as it is at the moment?
That's a major question. We haven't even broached yet this season one of the biggest risks that we had discussed post the appointment of Rodgers amidst his return, which was injury risk, and that which has been a persistent issue throughout his managerial career and his teams. That bit us early last season, and for the most part hasn't bit us yet this season. Hopefully it doesn't, but that's one of those variables that it's difficult to, as an outsider, to have any sense as far as what could occur. And that's, back to this issue, what Alan went over. To me, we've kind of gotten back into very close proximity of the neighborhood of peak Ange ball in these 3 games, meaning that what Alan described to me, the way I view that is we're so overwhelmingly dominant in all facets of the game that the domestic competition, particularly the way they set up and play, that's the other context, is they were just overwhelmed. I mean, it was, if I was a bigger person, I'd almost feel sorry for him. I don't, but if I was, actually a good person, but so, I think that'll get stress tested. It'll get stress tested when we face opposition that aren't as naive and having these kind of externalities, settled, well-coached opposition on a relative basis. Domestically, I think that'll be a stress test. To Alan's point, I'm skeptical most of this is translatable to higher quality competition, particularly even pot 3 and pot 4 teams, the 4 games that we'll get in the Champions League. So encouraging, because again, for a lot of last season, we didn't even really get into this neighborhood, right? So that's what Alan's referencing are benchmarks for, okay, we're in that neighborhood again. And, we've had a settled side for the most part, the return of a lot of the best players, to not to make excuses, but because again, there's some culpability relative to the injury issues, but we had a lot of chopping and changing, not a very settled lineup for huge swaths of last season. And when we did towards the last 2 months, I'd say we're approaching, like you could see the progress towards this destination. So the fact that we're continuing is emblematic that we have a good coach. I mean, that's, which we kind of knew and know, and but it's always validating and reassuring to see it happen.
Yeah, you touched on it there, James. The benchmarking and the pots and things like that for the Champions League. You actually did quite a bit of a breakdown of benchmarking against other sort of similar sized clubs within Europe and how we measure up against those. What were your findings from doing that little bit of work in terms of where Celtic stack up at the moment compared to, teams that we feel like we should be challenging around us within the European landscape?
Oh boy, trying to bring the podcast down. We just came off this great performance and result, and feel good first 3 games, and
Listen, I didn't put together the figures, and some may have said that the figures should have actually been in a larger font, but we'll not go there.
Well, fair enough. You know what? The software I use to do this doesn't allow me to make a bigger font, so let me disclose that it wasn't all my fault. Well, it was my fault because I didn't realize that until I went back to check after that comment. Yeah, so basically what I did is I looked at, well, let me first preface this by saying that the club coefficients from UEFA are like any other model. It's useful to help answer certain questions, but it isn't necessarily great at answering others, meaning that it's not something to say this club's better than that club or this team's better than that team. It's basically how the team's done in Europe, and there's huge context. Back to Alan's our chronic point, it's context. So teams that are primarily in the Europa League are going to rack up coefficient points, whereas maybe they would get slaughtered in Champions League, that kind of thing. So I basically what I did just to create a logical, reasonable peer group for Celtic. And I've done this in the past, but I've updated it. I update it periodically, usually, most seasons in the summer when we have some downtime, is basically the teams above us in UEFA club coefficient, and then a couple of other names that we know and near and dear to our heart from the past, like Malmo or, those that we've faced and lost to. And what you see, I did it in various ways, but when you break down the transfer activity, we don't really benchmark well against the top clubs, the Ajax. And I didn't even include the Ajax, the Benficas, and the Portos in the sample because they're so far out of sample. Like they have strategic reasons that they've dominated relative to player trading. But I looked at it, what's profit been from the 2012-2013 season up through what I call kind of the end of the old era, meaning that you see prices shift, really accelerate in a transfer market, and you see the adoption rate of analytics really ramp up starting in the 16-17 season, when Rodgers first arrived, ironically, again, just a coincidence. And when you compare those periods, and what I'm looking for is evidence of clubs that are smart, right? It's not that they're great at the transfer or player trading, but who's executing a smart strategy that's manifesting in a couple of things. Either they're making a lot of money, that's one way you could measure a good player trading model, or it's manifesting in a higher quality competitive team on the pitch. And sometimes it's both, like an Atalanta who's made huge progress. So basically what I did is I took a snapshot of the first 4 years and then compare it to the 8-year kind of post analytics period. And regrettably, Celtic don't benchmark very well. And we don't benchmark very well amongst clubs of comparable financial resources, whether that's like a Dynamo Zagreb or Red Star. I'm looking at my list here. Some of the big Greek clubs, decent size. They're not in the big five. These were all teams outside the big 5 leagues too, by the way. I should have prefaced that in this peer group. So our overall profitability hasn't been good. And one of my gauges for smartness relative to player trading is profit margin, meaning that you're buying and selling, all this money is kind of going to agent fees. And, it's almost like someone in the financial markets paying commissions to trade, right? It's like, were you actually doing it to make money, or are you just giving your broker all this money? And, I think we've given agents a lot of money with all of this player trading that we've had. But it hasn't actually, from a profitability perspective, we don't benchmark well on a profitability basis. Our margin that I calculate is about 11%. And the only teams that were below us is Alan's infamous corner of shame and his graphs that he does. It's the financial basket cases, which the Turkish clubs are infamous for that. They're always like incinerating capital and overspending and running a deficit. Rangers, which is right above, if you can believe that, the Turkish clubs, and Karabag. And again, I'm not criticizing Karabag because they've actually punched above their weight in Europe. Like they're actually above us in their European club coefficient, and their amount of volume, like they trade hardly at all. Like they're not a player trading club, so their profit margin doesn't really matter that much. So we're talking a couple of million euros per window. Like it's almost they're in a kind of different category from a player trading specific perspective. And then if you look in the upper right-hand corner, like the really well-run smart clubs that have adopted and prioritized being smart with their decision-making, you've got Alkmaar, you've got Midtjylland, you've got Bodo Glimt. These are clubs that are not only benefiting from getting better on the pitch, but also high profit margins. They're being smart with their player trading model. And that's ultimately what I come down to. It's figuring out a model and being smart about it. And even we'll get on to about the transfer rumors. Even a club like Brighton, who people talk about being a really smart club, if you actually look at their profitability, they're not that profitable in their player trading model. And they're okay. But if you think about being a smart Brighton, what is their major financial benefit? It's staying in the Premier League. Like they have to not get relegated. I mean, it's like $100 million a year. They're not going to make $100 million pounds a year. They're not going to make that in player trading. That's not realistic to do that consistently. Whereas if they just stay up, that's $100 million pounds every season in perpetuity or more as the money goes up. So, so they are being smart. They're reinvesting. They're not trying to, have this huge profitable player trading model. They're being reasonably profitable and then plowing that back in to get quality product on the pitch to make sure that they're not getting relegated. So it's about this discussion of how do you measure and like identify who's doing things smart and how do you kind of recognize that. And that's my criticism has been and continues to be of Celtic, is we're just not operating as a smart club. There's no real earmarker other than that, kind of financially, which you could maybe make that argument. I have a disagreement on that to a degree, but most importantly, benchmarking to basket cases is not a good way to progress. It's a good way to make yourself feel better about yourself, but it's not a great way to make progress. And particularly if their aspiration is to get better in Europe.
Yeah. Alan, so much of what James said there applies to the transfer rumours that we are seeing come out. Celtic, we are desperate for them to reinvest in the way a Brighton is doing. We are desperate for them to try and improve the squad in the way a Leicester looks like they're perhaps doing. And of course I am referring to, as we sit here and record this, we believe that an offer of around £30 million for Matt O'Reilly, which would smash our transfer record, has been made by Brighton. There's also rumoured interest in Rio Hatate. The O'Reilly move seems inevitable. The Hatate move seems unthinkable. Alan, in your opinion, where would that leave us with only 2 weeks of the transfer window to go if we were sitting here heading into the St Mirren game on Friday without perhaps the two most talented players we have at the club?
Yeah, I mean, so we have to aspire to one of the reasons, as James says, English Premier League clubs, £100 million from television every year, guaranteed. They don't need to make enough money from player trading for its own sake in terms of their balance sheet. They just need it to make sure they've got a strong enough squad to stay in the Premier League. That's the point, right? We need to be strong. In my view, we need to be strong enough that we need to be able to beat teams like Midtjylland, who we've lost to, Bodo Glimt that we've lost to, and Alkmaar that we nearly lost to, right? So that's step one. Is that's why Celtic need to acquire money to be able to be better than those teams, so that when inevitably the coefficient drops, such that we need to be playing qualifiers to get into the Champions League, we can dispatch teams like that. Right, because that's the benchmark we should be testing ourselves against, not delinquent, shambles of clubs across the river. That's just nonsense. We have to benchmark ourselves against these clubs, and we're not going to get 100 million from television. Therefore, the only way we can generate funds over and beyond Champions League money, which is dependent on football results and having a high-quality squad, is through player trading. That's why it's such important to Celtic. That's why it's so important we use the right benchmarks to do that. And actually, sadly, from a pure fan perspective, we're in a situation at the moment where, exactly what Brendan Rodgers said last season, Matt O'Reilly is at peak asset age, right? He's 23 years old. He's 3 years left on his contract. This is the best time to sell him off the back of an absolutely incredible season. I don't want to see him leave. I'd love Matt, or I'd love, I remember the Lisbon Lions. I'd love, 11 guys from Scotland to be brilliant for Celtic and all that, right? But listen, in terms of, sadly, and it comes down to money, in terms of developing as a football club, we need to walk the walk as a player trading model, which means selling your best players at peak asset value. But that only works if you've then got a pipeline behind that replaces those players with players of equivalent potential. We're not going to buy a Matt O'Reilly replacement, because guess what? That will cost at least 30 million, because that's what the market says he's worth, right? So we're not going to do that. We're going to buy a player who's probably not quite at Matt O'Reilly's level, but has the potential, hopefully, to reach that. And that's what we need to aspire to do. And it's kind of similar with Hatate. Hatate's 26 years old now. We've talked about this in the past. He's not been a professional footballer that long. He's probably logically nearer 23 in terms of his football experience, if you like. But again, he's probably at peak asset age as far as selling him is. Now, that leaves Celtic with a huge problem in central midfield. And all the things I talked about in terms of Celtic performing this season in a way that is because we're so coherent. All 10 outfield players were there last season. We've got that understanding. We've got that cohesion. That would all get blown out the window if we sold both of them. But what the club should be doing in the background is having the pipeline identified of players to replace those two that, as I say, are probably just a little bit below, but have the potential. We know what Bernardo can do in that situation. We know what Holm can do. We've had him in the door for over a year and a half now. We know what Iwata can do. We should be able to bridge that gap, providing we get those players in to replace the two that we sell. But again, I don't necessarily want to see either of them leave from a purely footballing fan perspective, but from a transfer model, from a how do we get better as a club, how do we grow as a club, we should be selling these players now. We should be selling them for the absolute top dollar.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with that. And James mentioned a club in his benchmark in Ajax. They're very much a club that follow that kind of model as well. And every 5 to 10 years have a team that peaks with, a deep run in the Champions League or something like that before the vultures come in and sort of rip the carcass off of the squad. But I don't think it's something that we would object to if we were getting those forays into Europe every 4 or 5 years. If then the squad get taken apart and we started again, it would be a fair sight better than what we've had in the last 20 years. That's for sure. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching this week. I appreciate I am merely Harold Bratback to Sutton and Larson sitting opposite me, but I have enjoyed it nonetheless. I don't know if there's anything either of you guys want to add before we sign off.
No, just thanks again for signing on the dotted line, and look forward to a great season collectively.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Echo that, James. Brilliant to have you on board, and it is just the first of what I think will be many exciting developments for the channel, so watch this space.
Yes, absolutely. Keep an eye on all the socials for both James and Alan, and for the Huddle Breakdown if you want to be updated on their plans for the future of the entire podcast and everything that goes with it. James, Alan, thank you very much for joining me, and we will see you all again next week.